Our new course is for anyone who's always wanted to learn about the history of the German Air Force in a more systematic way, one of the most revolutionary combat forces of the 20th century in World War II. It's our course Luftwaffe from the first to the last day, which will start with live classes in the second half of July. It's very easy to sign up. Just click the link in the description and secure your spot. So don't miss this opportunity because I'll be waiting for you there. If you've already watched Band of Brothers, you definitely remember that scene from episode 2 on the morning of D-Day. In it, the soldier Donald Malarkey is walking toward the Easy Company's command post, and he comes across a group of German prisoners on the side of the road, and he makes a joke, right? He asks like this, with the tone of a colonel or general, "Where are you from, boy?" And then one of the prisoners surprisingly answers him in English, "I'm from such and such city." And then Malarkey comes back surprised and talks to the guy. "Man, are you American? What are you doing here?" And the guy tells him that he was of German descent and had returned to Germany because the German government had encouraged re-immigration, the return to the Third Reich. Very well. That scene ends in a somewhat tragic way for the German prisoners, actually quite tragic. But have you ever imagined that this exact situation could happen to Brazilian soldiers? Have you ever imagined that the Brazilian Expeditionary Force might have had this kind of contact with Brazilians serving in the German army? Surprisingly, I can tell you the answer is yes. On August 9, 1945, the same day the second atomic bomb was dropped in Japan, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force was fully concentrated in the city of Francolese, near Naples, in the south of Italy. The first group to return was already in Brazil, having come back the previous month in July, and the rest, about 20,000 Brazilians, were camped there, waiting for their turn to return to the country. That's when the Americans arrived with a truck, and from that truck, 9 German soldiers got out. Who were these soldiers? According to the Americans, those soldiers claimed to be Brazilian and spoke Portuguese. And now, according to international law, they should be repatriated to their country and therefore placed under the jurisdiction of the Brazilian military justice system. General Olimpio Falconier da Cunha, the commander of the remaining FEB units in Italy, then communicated this fact to General Mascarenhas, who was already in Rio de Janeiro. And General Mascarenhas, then commander of the FEB, sent his order via telegraph to Italy, ordering that those 9 prisoners be put on the next FEB troop transport to Brazil, which would take place on August 12, 1945, aboard the American ship SS Mariposa. Those 9 men who had surrendered and claimed to be Brazilian were Bronius Ayaucas, Walter Belitz, Carlos Hager, Wilhelm Bachkasten, Friedrich Reber, Carlos Riebel, Karl Haller, Lauro Kern, and Karl Georg Haff on August 22, 1945. The prisoners arrived in Brazil along with the FEB troops and were immediately taken to the central prison of the Federal District. Remember, Rio de Janeiro was the Federal District then, a model prison, a new building that had been inaugurated in 1941, and, unlike the vast majority of Brazilian prisons at that time, had extensive facilities for inmate labor. But now, going back in time to April 30, 1945, in the town of Fornovo di Taro in northern Italy, where the 148th Infantry Division of the Wehrmacht had just surrendered to the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. In the midst of those immense and continuous columns of German infantry soldiers coming down from Fornovo di Taro toward the collection and surrender posts, Major João Carlos Gross, commander of the 1st Battalion of the 6th Infantry Regiment, set out on foot to inspect the columns of prisoners, and to verify in accordance with international law, as reinforced by General Mascarenhas de Moraes, that the prisoners were not being mistreated by the Italian partisans who were present throughout the area. As he approached one of the columns of prisoners, Gross then heard some of the prisoners speaking to him in Portuguese. Of course, it was perfect Brazilian Portuguese, and completely taken by surprise by that situation, Juan Carlos Gross then pulled that prisoner out of the line. He then said that he was the Curitiba native Carlos Luis Hubel, who before returning to Germany had lived in Niterói, there in Rio de Janeiro, and at that time he was 36 years old. He had participated in the entire German army campaign since 1939, had fought in Operation Barbarossa, and had even been wounded in action in Russia. 1916. He had fought in Operation Barbarossa, and had even been wounded in action in Russia. So, he took Hubel to the headquarters of the 6th Infantry Regiment to introduce him to the commander, Colonel Nelson de Mello. The 2nd section of the 6th Infantry Regiment's general staff, the intelligence section. They were desperately in need of a translator, so Nelson de Mello authorized Hubel to remain on duty with the 2nd section of the general staff for the entire period of interrogations of many of the nearly 15,000 prisoners captured in Fornovo de Taro. Hubel, therefore, ended up providing these translation services to the Brazilian Expeditionary Force between April 30 and May 9, 1945, when he was then sent into American custody. Now, moving forward in time, on November 11, 1945, there in Rio de Janeiro, the then Minister of War, General Pedro Aurelio de Goy Monteiro, ordered the opening of the military police inquiry to judge the actions of those 9 captured German soldiers. The crime for which they were indicted was included in the new military legal code, which stated that by taking up arms against Brazil in a wartime context, that individual would be subject to a maximum penalty of death or a minimum sentence of 20 years in prison. The first thing that was done was to actually verify the Brazilian citizenship of those 9 men. And then something quite interesting was discovered. 3 of them really did not have Brazilian citizenship. They were born in Europe and emigrated to Brazil at a very young age. These 3 were Bronius Ialkas, who had Lithuanian citizenship, Karl Hüller, who had Austrian citizenship, and Karl Georg Ralph Lehner, who had German citizenship. Lehner, in fact, was a sergeant in the Luftwaffe who had fought throughout the entire war in the Kampfgeschwader 3, or the 3rd Bomber Wing of the Luftwaffe, flying as a radio operator in Junkers Ju-88 bombers. Lehner had even been awarded on January 16, 1944, the German Cross in Gold, the 2nd highest German decoration, for bravery for his actions during KG-3's support of the Kursk offensive in the summer of the previous year. There was also the case of the Bahian Carlos Hage, who had not specifically served in the German armed forces, but rather in the Todt organization, a kind of labor front that built war infrastructure for the German army. Since the first 3 men, then, could not be charged with the crime of taking up arms against Brazil, as they were not actually Brazilian citizens, and Hage had not specifically taken part in military actions against Brazil. The 4 ended up being released on April 29, 1946. Against the other 5, then, who had been born on national territory and joined the German armed forces, a complaint was then filed on August 27, 1946. This accusation, then, of taking up arms against Brazil in a state of war was brought against Walter Berlitz, who had been a corporal in the Luftwaffe's anti-aircraft unit and was born in Porto Alegre, against Wilhelm Kasten, born in Salvador Bahia, who had served as a sailor in the Kriegsmarine with the 7th Submarine Flotilla at the Saint-Nazaire base during the war, against Friedrich Huber from Ribeirão Preto, São Paulo, who had served in the 35th Panzer Regiment of the famous 4th Panzer Division, against Carlos Luis Huber from Curitiba, who had been part of the 148th Infantry Division which had surrendered to the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. And later he worked as an interpreter for the 6th Infantry Regiment, and finally against Lauro Cone from Rio Grande do Sul, also a soldier in the Luftwaffe. The defense team for the 5 defendants was led by the famous lawyer from Minas Gerais, Heraclito Fontoura Sobral Pinto, who throughout his career was a great champion of human rights in Brazil. The defense argued that all the defendants had very close German ancestry, meaning they were either children or grandchildren. Grandchildren of Germans born in Germany had been convinced to return to Germany due to the Third Reich's program to bring ethnic Germans back to Germany, and that upon arriving there, they found themselves in a totalitarian system that quickly went to war and did not tolerate refusal of military service, which was punishable by imprisonment or even execution. Finally, Sobral Pinto argued that all 5 defendants had joined the German armed forces before Brazil's declaration of war, and that after Brazil became an enemy of Germany in August 1942, requesting to leave military service was simply impossible in that country, forcing these men to continue fighting with the Wehrmacht. Finally, Sobral Pinto concluded by saying that the accusation, the crime for which they were being charged, was only included in the Military Justice Code enacted in 1944, not in the previous version of the same Military Justice Code. Therefore, those defendants had committed the acts covered by that crime before it was officially established. And since justice cannot be retroactive, they were not technically committing that offense. In this way, the majority of the court voted on the 20th of May 1947 for the acquittal of the 5 defendants who were considered to be involved in the events of the war and were immediately released. Today we know that 2,200,000 foreigners served in the Wehrmacht during the World War II, a number equivalent to 12% of the total strength of the German armed forces in World War II. And among them, today we believe that hundreds of Brazilians were there, although it's impossible to know their exact number. But we get this estimate from the fact that the Brazilian military mission in Berlin, established right at the end of the war to deal with the Brazilians who were stranded there in European territory seeking repatriation, managed to repatriate them. By the end of its work in 1951, a total of 2,445 people. And it's from this total number that the men of military age between 1939 and 1945 are identified. Now tell me, did you like learning about this very peculiar episode in Brazil's history during World War II? Did you already know about this? Tell us here in the comments. And don't miss your chance to study much more about the history of the Third Reich with our Luftwaffe course from beginning to end. Click the link in the description and secure your spot because our course starts in a few weeks and you're going to learn a lot from it. If you like this video, then share it with your friends, but also give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to Sala de Guerra so you don't miss anything else. I'll wrap it up here. Thank you again for watching. And here's a big hug from Sala de Guerra.